The victory of Team England in the 1966 FIFA World Cup over their West German rivals is seen by many in England as one of the proudest moments in the nation's post-war history, akin to how the moon landing is seen in the United States. And just like the moon landing, there is long the question, will this feat be repeated while those who witnessed it the first time around are still alive? With the Beatles at their height, and Labour under Harold Wilson winning a landslide re-election on the promise of modernising Britain, and to top it off, England hosting and winning the FIFA World Cup in 1966, the future for Britain seemed bright indeed. Yet, by 1970, these dreams had come crashing down. At the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, history failed to repeat itself, and instead, England lost to West Germany 3-2 and was knocked out during the quarter-finals. On the political front, things weren't much better, as 4 days later, Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who had been 7% ahead in the polls and had been predicted to easily win re-election, in one of the most unexpected upsets in British political history, lost to Edward Heath's Conservatives by a margin of 5%, confounding the expectations of many people, including Heath himself. At the time, many in the Labour Party blamed this unexpected result on England's defeat in the World Cup. But why was this? How can a World Cup change the way people vote? And what other factors might have been at play? The fact that this election and the World Cup happened around the same time was no accident. One quirk of British politics is that while elections must be held every 5 years, at this time the Prime Minister could also call elections whenever they wanted. The last election before 1970 was in March of 1966, but rather than wait the full 5 years, Wilson called the election 8 months early for June 1970. The reasons why Wilson made this decision show that his government was on more shaky ground than it first appears, and indeed this decision was somewhat influenced by the World Cup. Wilson was torn between two potential options, holding the election in summer or autumn. Holding the election in summer might mean the good weather might boost national spirits. Also, the British economy, while in a somewhat stable state at this point, after the devaluation crisis of 1967, was still on shaky ground, and Wilson thought that holding an election earlier in the summer, while the economy appeared to be in relatively okay shape, would do much to increase his chances of re-election. But this would mean the election campaign would have to share airtime with the 1970 FIFA World Cup in Mexico, and if England were knocked out, this could backfire and actually put people in a worse mood. Whereas waiting until fall would mean that Wilson would not have to worry about the impact of the World Cup, but this would mean Wilson would lose the potential effect of good weather. And should the economy take a sudden downward turn due to rising inflation or a large strike, he could lose his lead in the polls and risk losing to the Conservatives. Roy Jenkins, Wilson's Chancellor, put it simply when he said, "The risk of June is the World Cup, the risk of October is rising prices." Wilson was not entirely crazy for thinking that good weather could have an influence on an election. The long and exceptionally warm summer of 1959 is widely seen as a contributing factor for helping the Conservative Party under Harold Macmillan keep their hold on power, as Labour's claims that the Conservatives were leading Britain to ruin were somewhat undermined by the glorious weather and the comfort brought on by the new technologies and consumer boom of the late 1950s. And so, Wilson was hoping to emulate Macmillan's success in coasting effortlessly into another parliamentary term. When the 1970 local council elections in May returned better than expected results for Wilson, and with the Labour Party still 7% ahead of the Conservatives in most polls, Wilson decided that competing with the World Cup was worth the risk and called an election for June. Wilson decided to have the election on Thursday the 18th of June 1970, during the World Cup quarter-finals. Since England had won the championship last time, Wilson was confident that England could progress this far without much danger of defeat. Then, he could have the election during the World Cup without risking a defeat souring the national mood. Unfortunately for Wilson, and tragically for the England team, England would go on to be knocked out of the World Cup in the quarter-finals by their old rivals, the West Germans, because of a heart-breaking 3-2 goal by the Germans in extra time. And 3 days later, the polls for the election closed. Before the results came in, Heath was sitting alone at a bar, expecting certain defeat. The Conservatives were already making moves to replace him as leader when the results came in, while Wilson was enjoying a nice stay at the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, surrounded by his government ministers, in a jolly mood. When the first results came in from Guildford, it showed a surprise 5% swing for the Conservatives, which instantly flipped the mood of the two parties, putting Wilson and his entourage into stunned silence. It turned out that Guildford perfectly represented the national mood, as throughout the country there was a 5% swing for the Conservatives. and the Conservatives went from 253 seats to 330, a parliamentary majority, and Heath was confirmed as Britain's next Prime Minister. But how can an election and a World Cup possibly be linked? Most polling ended a couple days before the country voted, so data is lacking, which is why many continue to speculate the reasons for such a drastic, late change in how people voted, and how the polls just a few days earlier had been so wrong. Firstly, it is true that the World Cup did distract from the general election, making it hard for Wilson to connect with the electorate and promote his policies.
It wasn't aggressive enough. I mean, it was a little namby-pamby. There was a lot of fun and games.
In fact, Wilson said that no Prime Minister this century has fought an election with such a background of economic strength as we have today. But for people who remembered the devaluation crisis of 1967, the rise of inflation, and the resulting cutbacks in government spending, this came off as very pompous. Edward Heath, Wilson's Conservative rival, was not much better, and the election was fast becoming something of an unpopularity contest. To make matters worse, 1970 was also the dawn of colour television, and many people reported they were frankly more interested in the football than the election. The second reason, given by many, including some high-ranking members of the Labour Party, is that England's defeat in the World Cup put many people in a depressive mood, and thus kept people away from the polls. Tony Crossland, the Minister for Local Government at the time, blamed the results on a mix of party complacency and the disgruntled match-of-the-day millions. Whilst hardly the only reason, it is true that voter turnout was lower in the 1970 election compared to previous elections, and as was explained during election news coverage at the time.
But there's also the assumption that many people have that apathy hurts the Labour Party. It's more like that Labour Party supporters stay away than that Conservative Party supporters stay away. The evidence on this is somewhat mixed, but the polls before the election were showing Conservatives were more determined to vote, and so I suppose drops in turnout do help the Conservatives, or maybe thought to.
Of course, the World Cup was not the only deciding factor for most people staying away from the polls or even changing their vote to the Conservatives. Some people have speculated that Wilson lost most of the votes to the Conservatives because of Wilson's lax immigration policies. This is in part because in 1968, Conservative MP Enoch Powell gave his famous Rivers of Blood speech, warning of the risks posed by increased immigration to Britain of peoples from Asia and the Caribbean, which some say attracted working-class voters who would have to compete with the cheap workers from abroad to the Conservative Party. In fact, whilst today the speech is infamous because of its racial language, a poll at the time said that 74% of people agreed with Powell. But this didn't really do much to increase the Conservative share of the vote. For one, Enoch Powell was kicked off the Conservative Shadow Cabinet, the highest ranks of the Conservative Party in Parliament, and Heath himself said,
"I told Mr. Powell that he could not remain a member of the Shadow Cabinet because of the inflammatory nature of his speech at Birmingham. I considered that this was likely to make racial relations more difficult."
And the National Front Party, which was a new political party that campaigned heavily on the immigration issue, was only able to field candidates in 10 seats and got only 3.6% of the vote. And beyond that, the immigration issue hardly came up and was not a deciding factor. What was far more important to most people was the economy. Wilson had presided over several economic troubles, including the devaluation crisis of 1967, rising inflation, and economic stagnation. But as said before, Wilson campaigned on the promise that for most people, the worst was now behind them. Yet days before the election, trading figures revealed the government had run a £31 million deficit for the month of May, just under £500 million in today's money, which somewhat undercut Wilson's message that the UK economy was now on solid ground. This was pounced on by Heath and the media, but although these figures were not encouraging, most people and news outlets still assumed Wilson was set for an election victory, although not a landslide. What probably did the most to bring Wilson down was something that had been quietly bubbling away for years, something that affected a particular group that was not normally at the heart of political consideration: housewives. As a result of Wilson devaluing the pound and the numerous strikes for higher wages, there had been a major rise in inflation, and the price of many household goods had increased as a result. This adversely affected housewives who may not have been in control of their own finances, yet still had to do the majority of the shopping to feed their family. And so, they would have felt the pinch of rising prices more than most other members of society. Heath raised this point himself, saying, "Inflation hurt those least able to protect themselves as well as the ordinary housewife. Is it any wonder that housewives keep telling me they are having to cut down on the family's weekly joint, getting cheaper meat, smaller cuts, or they are having to buy standard eggs from the supermarket instead of larger ones, and make children's shoes go a little longer?" This struck a chord with housewives who changed their vote to the Conservatives, hence why this election is sometimes called the Housewives election, as they represented the largest and most visible group most affected by the slump in the economy and that grew tired of Wilson's attitude of saying everything was fine. And so, in the end, it was not the World Cup that changed people's minds and made them switch parties so late in the election campaign. The reason the 1970 World Cup was blamed, and why this theory survives in popular imagination, is not so much the reality of the situation, but what the years 1966 and 1970 have come to represent. 1966 is the year that Britain felt as though it was turning the tide of decline, that despite the fall of empire, Britain still had a place in the world as an industrial and political power, with a popular culture that was the epitome of modern and cool around the world. Yet, by 1970, devaluation, inflation, and stagnation had brought these hopes to a crash and broke the spell of Wilson's image as a modernizer and competent economic leader. And the 1970s will be remembered as a time of hardship and division. The World Cup victories and defeats didn't cause this change, but they were perfectly timed to symbolise the change in Britain's fortunes, from a nation hoping for the dawn of a new age to one coming to terms with a new reality. And with that, many people turned to another political party in hopes of a course correction to improve their situation. Unfortunately for many, the harder times were yet to come. I hope you enjoyed this video and thanks for watching. If you want to see more from Newsreel History, remember to like, comment and subscribe to see more content. And I'll see you next time.